Okay, now it's time for closure. So I have my suture loaded on my needle here, see, like that. And then the rest of the suture I'm just going to gather up in my hand, and I kind of do this back and forth motion a little bit, just so I can contain that suture in my hand, because we don't have a big giant drape here. And then remember, we're going to start from deep to superficial, so I'm just going to reflect the skin back a little bit here, and I'm going to go deep into that fat, and then using the curve of the needle and the flick of the wrist, so I'm coming out right at that epidermal dermal junction, grabbing the needle and then resetting again, and then I'm carefully pulling this through so that I don't have my suture flying all over the place. And I like to go until I have about 1.25 inches maybe of tag there. Then I'm going to gather my suture. A lot of times I'll just leave it like that as long as it's within the sterile surface. And then remember that angle technique of the needle. So I'm holding up the skin here, and then I'm going to angle, so this is my surface here. So I'm going to just go in right at that epidermal junction, and so you can see my needle right under the skin. And then I am going to flick it around, and back out a little bit, and there I'm coming deep. Do you see that? So superficial to deep. I'm going to pull that through. And again, I'm being cautious of keeping my suture where I want it. Now, this is an important point here. If I tie this over this loop, it's never going to bury, right? So I just pass that short loop or short tag over to the other side, and see how that comes nicely together. And then I'm going to tie, probably I'll do a surgeon's knot. I'm using 2/0 here so you can see the suture a little bit better. So I'm going to put the needle between the long end and short end, and 1, 2, and then I'm going to have this knot, see how I even that out, is going to go along the long axis of the incision. So I tighten that a little bit. So between long and short end, 1 loop around, rotate, and grab that end, and bring it back over. So that's 2 throws, 3, and 4. And I like my tag to be on this side so that when I bury it, it goes even deeper. So I'm going to trim that tag. So I've got some scissors here. So there's my tag. I'm going to place my suture carefully there. Grab my tag end and cut. Okay? All right, so now we've got our line coming from deep. You want to be careful not to grab your suture like I just did, because you could damage it if it's going to be a knot somewhere else. So now I'm coming from deep. So now I like to, whenever I handle my suture too, I like to grab my needle just behind where the suture is wedged on. So I grab it there. There's like a little platform for your needle drivers to go. And I'm going to go underneath my suture and pop up at the apex of the incision, so right at the edge of the incision, which I think is about there. And it takes some time to figure out where your needle is, so determining where the curve is and where your needle tip is really important. So now I'm coming through, so now I'm coming deep from the apex of my incision. See that? See how it's almost starting to close already? Some people don't do that added step of going underneath the knot, but I really like to, so that I can get a little bit more control. So now I'm going to snake back and forth through the skin. I like to take bites, a big bite like this, big bite, big bite, big bite, big bite, so that I know I really have a good purchase on the tissue, versus doing a spiral pattern, which is little bite, little bite, little bite, little bite. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to just hold the skin back a little bit, and I'm going to, at first I'm going to do a couple small bites, like smaller than I normally would once I get going. So that's a small bite there. And it's right at that epidermal dermal junction. And then same thing on this side. Just a little bit smaller bite. There we go. Pull that through. And then grab my needle again. And I say, okay, I'm gonna go straight across, but I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. So I'm gonna go pretty close to where I came out here. And then my bites are usually about half of what's left in the needle. So in other words, if I'm holding it here, my bite is about half of that to a third of that. So I'm coming along here. So I would bring this along, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit so I don't get in front of myself too much. So I go in and out, and again, it's that powerful holding layer that I'm in between the epidermis and the dermal junction. So I just keep moving along here. So I bring that straight forward. So now I'm going to start thinking about closing. When I have about this much left, like a centimeter and a half or so. So on this side, I'm going to do our setup, which is superficial deep. So I'm going to go on that epidermal dermal junction. See how I'm like right under the skin there? And then looping down, or not looping down, but driving down deep. So see how that's superficial deep? So now that's my sutures coming from deep. Now, it's just how I started is how to end. So on this side, I'm going to go deep superficial, and on this side, I'm going superficial deep. So just like the practice pad. So I'm going to go deep into that subcute fat, and then I'm going to come out right there at that dermal epidermal junction. So that's deep superficial. And I'm going to keep this loop that's created. And I often use like an instrument to hold this so I don't forget about it. So I'm going to hook that. So that's my deep loop. You see how that's coming from deep? And then I have one throw left now to close this. So I usually go halfway between here and here to make sure that closes nicely. So I lift that up a little bit, and I'm putting my needle in. See how it's right underneath the skin? Superficial. Oops, I lost my loop. Let's replace that before I forget to. So there's my loop. Let's grab my needle again. Try that one more time. So last throw is superficial deep. So superficial, see it's right underneath the skin there, and then I drive it deep into that fat. I'm not going into the muscle. There we go. Okay, does this make sense? So here's our deep loop. And I'm just going to pull this through. And I do this kind of by according in my other hand. So, and I want everything on this side. So if this loop was over here, I would have to pull it through. So we want everything on this side. So those last two throws, deep superficial here, I kept that deep loop, and then superficial deep, and here's the deep loop or the deep line coming. So I just tie these two together to close this. Okay? And give yourself a decent loop so this is pretty easy to do. So again, drive it between long end and short end. One loop around, usually in most cases that's fine, and then rotate, grab that loop. And then remember, when we're doing these, we want to be along the long axis of the incision, so this way. And I always open my jaws so that I'm pulling equally on both sides of that loop. All right, and drive it between long end and short end, one loop around, rotate, grab that loop, open jaws. And you really want to feel the suture there, but we're not too tight that it's not scrunching up our incision. So between long and short end, loop around your drivers, rotate, grab, pull through, and open jaws. And I think we have one more. I've lost track. So we'll do one more here. And then we're going to cut the loops off of our knot. And then this next part is called smurfing. So again, I'm watching where my suture is. I often hold it up like this so that I create a little tent. So this is like the center pole of the tent. Then I direct my needle right next to that knot, right perpendicular down, and then as far as I can get just under the skin, and I oftentimes will push like this to get it to go through. Let's push that through just a little bit more here, and then we can grab the end. Make sure you don't get any knots forming. That's happened to me before. And then I'm going to push down with my index finger and pull up, and oftentimes you'll feel like a little and the knot will turn upside down and bury. But see how that's nicely buried? And I'm so used to Olsen Hagar's where I just cut it off, but I don't have those today. So I'm just putting gentle pressure up and then cut. So ta-da! See how that looks pretty nice? So that is a simple benign mass excision. So remember, you want to determine the lines of tension first and just convince yourself that that's correct before you start, right? And then you measure the width of the mass, and here I have my mass that I excised, right? And I used my needle driver, and then I went out that width and made a dot, and then that width again along the long axis of the incision like that, just made those dots, and then I connected them with this nice ellipse. And the reason we do this 3-to-1 technique, so this is 1 width, 2 width, 3 width. The reason we do that 3-to-1 technique is we get a nice 33-degree angle here, which closes really nicely in the skin. All right, that's it, we're all done. And you can take off the clamps, and we're on our way. Thank you.